dark night. It was just before dark on that fateful night. Mark and Jim each carried a light. Two young boys returning from a hike, soon to encounter a frightful sight. Mark noticed it first, and he stopped on the trail, and both boys listened to the curious wail. Half man, half animal is what it sounded like, and the terrible screeching echoed on into the night. Both boys stood, frozen in fear, listening to the scream so loud and so clear. And when the wailing stopped and the dark night grew cold, Mark suddenly remembered a story he'd been told about an old miner with a hump on his back who lived not far in a rickety old shack. They said he was crazy, said he was mean. They said he was the weirdest person they'd seen. And in the dark night, the old man would walk. This very forest was the place he would stalk, searching for gold, or so it was thought. And although he's dead now, these woods he still haunts. So Mark and Jim, two brave young boys, went to investigate the strange wailing noise. The trail they left and traipsed through the night, two young boys and only two lights. They walked through the night into the forest so thick, until they came to a babbling creek. They followed the stream as it wound through the woods, through valleys and fields as far as they could. They came to a meadow, but didn't know where they were at. But on the other side of the field sat a lonely old shack. They waited and watched on that cold, dark night and listened for the sound that had given them fright. Not a thing could be heard, there was nothing to see. And both boys knew this was no place to be. Not on a night so dark and so cold. Not in the forest where the old miner roamed. In the beam of his light, Jim saw it appear, and as it approached, he trembled with fear. A strange fog so dense and so gray. A strange fog was coming this way. Like smoke it rolled toward them over grass tall and thick, until finally at their ankles the strange mist did lick. It was cold and damp and felt clammy and wet, and all around the boys the strange cloud sat. And across the field so dark and so black, a light suddenly beckoned from the old run-down shack. The boys were terrified, scared out of their minds as they stared at the shack sitting beneath the dark pines. A light in the window from a single candle glowed, and the boys wondered about the stories they'd been told. Could they be true? Could they be real? Does a strange old man still haunt these fields? And what of the light in the ragged old shack? Was the old miner here? Had he really come back? So quietly they walked through the misty gray fog, through the tall grass, over stumps, rocks, and logs. And all the while the mist swirled and danced. It swished and it floated, it whispered and pranced. Off in the night a coyote bayed, and an owl hooted from its perch far away. Bats spun through the night and made not a noise, while inside the old shack, someone waited for the boys. How could Mark and Jim know as they approached the old shack? How could they know they might never come back? And although Jim was scared right down to the core, he reached his hand forward and opened the door. Inside the shack, shadows sprang and leapt, letting loose with their mysteries and secrets they kept. For no one in years dared enter the house, not squirrel, not sparrow, not raccoon nor mouse. Even the animals were aware, it seemed, that the shack was alive and awful and mean. The doors squeaked open, the shadows they grew. They ran and they thrashed, they splashed and they flew. And Mark and Jim, two boys unaware, were about to receive a terrible scare. For in the old shack, leaning close to the light, the shape of the miner was a gruesome sight. He leaned forward on arms, all tattered and thin. His face was a skull with a nasty old grin. His hair was all gray and long and a mess, and below one eye socket was a large spider's nest. The boys at the door were stricken with shock, and there they stood motionless, stiff as a rock. So horrified they were, these two boys alone, it appeared that both of them were made out of stone. They dared not to move, not one single inch, not a quiver or tremble, not even a flinch. Not a sound did they utter, not a noise did they make, when suddenly the old miner began to shiver and shake. His brittle bones creaked and cracked with age, and his teeth chattered in a horrible rage. And then all went quiet and the silence returned, and in the boys' hearts a terrible fear burned. For they knew it was him, that the legends were true, that the stories and folklore, the fables were too. But why was he here? Why had he come back? Who was the old miner in this tattered old shack? In the growing silence, the boys had to know more. Mark was the first to step away from the door. He crept toward the chair where the skeleton did sit, toward the rickety old table where the candle was lit. And young Jim followed, his hands shaking with fright, as they approached the skeleton on this dark summer night. But now the skeleton sat rigid and still, and both boys felt a strange, cold chill. The dark night grew silent, the dark night grew cold, and the old miner spoke, and this is the story he told. I was young, I was alive, I was here, I did survive. Until one night, a terrible night, in this shack I saw a beautiful sight. A chest filled with treasure, with silver and gold. A chest filled with riches from pirates of old. It thrilled me then, yet it scares me tonight. It scared me so badly, I died from my fright. And so I must warn you, whatever you do, don't go upstairs, or you'll be like me too. With those final words, the skeleton fell to the floor, in a pile of bones and nothing more. The two boys just stared, for what could they do? What the skeleton had meant, they hadn't a clue. So in the glow of the candle on that cold, dark night, they decided upon a daring plight. Up the stairs the boys would climb, up the stairs for just a short time. If they saw anything that would cause them fright, they'd quickly turn and take flight. The staircase was dark and weary and old, but the boys tried to be fearless, brave and bold. As they reached the top, they stopped and stared. For what they saw, they were not prepared. For upstairs, in the dark and the gloom, sat a single large chest in the middle of the room. It was old and decaying and made of old wood and steel. And the boys' first thought was that this couldn't be real. A treasure chest in the upstairs room? A chest filled with treasure in the dark and the gloom? But they remembered the bony old miner and what he had said. One look inside, and they'd surely be dead. So the boys left the shack and traveled on home. They left the old man, his house and his home, and both went to bed feeling so safe and so sound, glad they had not peeked at the chest they had found. But there's more to this story, and this you must know, because Jim's curiosity rose and he wouldn't let it go. For Jim hungered for riches, for fortune and fame. Jim wanted his life to never be the same. He knew that with the treasure he'd have all that he'd need, but was there a price for his cunning and greed? So back through the dark night he crept all alone, back to the shack into the old miner's home. He crept up the stairs through the dark and the gloom. He crept upstairs to the single dark room. His heart pounded like thunder, his breathing was quick, while all around his feet a curious fog did lick. He walked toward the chest, he reached out his hand, he lifted the latch, and there he did stand. His eyes were like diamonds, all dazzling bright, for what was in the chest was an incredible sight. And later that night when he crept into bed, he'd forgotten about what the old miner said. Yet he was alive, he was certainly not dead, and he stuffed all the treasure underneath his bed. And in the morning when the sun did arise, his mother went to wake him and received a surprise. For beneath the covers was not a boy all alone, but all she found was a pile of gray bones. So if you should hear a shriek in the dead of the night, if you see an old shack and a single candle light, heed the old miner's words and you best beware. Don't look in the chest at the top of the stairs.